I thought I'd take a minute to just pay honor to a gentleman, the last U.S. veteran of World War I, who was laid to rest at Arlington just yesterday, and to actually put into the congressional record, and I'd like to read as much of it as I'm able before the other members come, because it struck me as something important. And it was a beautifully written article in the Post this morning, and I hope that many people got to see it, and I'm hoping many of our members were able to read it. I learned some things that I had actually no idea about, which will become apparent as I read this short article, but it was beautifully written by Paul Dugan, and I thought I'd just take a minute to read it into the record. This is the last U.S. veteran of World War I, so of course it wasn't just any ordinary funeral. Not that any funeral is ordinary, but it was extremely special to our country and to the world. President Obama was in attendance. Vice President Joe Biden was in attendance. And I'd just like to read as much of it as I can. A lowly corporal of long ago was buried Tuesday at Arlington National Cemetery, ushered to his grave with all the Army's old guard solemn pomp. Frank Woodruff Buckels lived to be 110, the last of nearly 5 million U.S. veterans of a dimly remembered war, a generation now laid to rest. In a late-day chill, after hundreds of strangers had paid their respects in public viewing since the weekend, soldiers carried the former doughboy's flag-draped coffin partway up a knoll and set it on polished rails above his plot. A stone's toss from the grave of his old Supreme Commander, General John J. Blackjack Pershing. A chaplain commended his soul to God, rifle volleys cracked, a bugler sounded taps below the gentle rise. With flags at half-staff throughout the U.S. military and government, it was a fine send-off for the country's last known veteran of World War I, who died peacefully February 27th in his West Virginia farmhouse. Yet the hallowed ritual at grave number 34-581 was not a farewell to one man alone. A reverent crowd of the powerful and the ordinary, President Obama, Vice President Biden, laborers and store clerks, heads bowed, came to salute Buckles' deceased generation, the vanished millions of soldiers and sailors he came to symbolize in the end. Who were they? Not the troops of the greatest generations so celebrated these days, but the unheralded ones of 1917 and 1918, who came home to pats on the back and little else in an era before the country embraced and rewarded its veterans. Their 20th century narrative, poignant and meaningful, is seldom recalled. I know my father would want me to be here, said Mike Oliver, 73, a retiree from Alexandria, leaning on a cane near the cemetery's amphitheater hours before the burial. Inside, a hushed procession of visitors filed past Buckles' closed coffin in the chapel. I'm here for Mr. Buckles. I'm here for what he represents, Oliver said, and on his left lapel, he wore a tiny gold pin, the insignia of his long-dead father's infantry division in World War I, the Army's 80th. I'm here to say goodbye to my dad, he said. Buckles, who fibbed his way into the Army at 16, was a rear echelon ambulance driver in war-ravaged France, miles behind the battlefront. More than 116,000 Americans died, about half in the fighting, but most of the rest from illnesses in the nation's 19-month-long engagement in a conflict that scorched Europe for 4 years. Now the veterans who survived are all gone. What's left is remembrance, the collective story of 4.7 million lives, an obituary for a generation. Arriving stateside in 1918 and 1919, many of them scarred in mind and limb, they were met by post-war recession and joblessness. A lot of veterans thought that they were owed a boost that they ought to be compensated for the good civilian wages they had missed. But unfortunately, those are my words, unfortunately, the words are, but lawmakers after a year said no. Year after year said no. Oh, the YMCA did give me a 1-month free membership, Buckels recalled when he was a very old fellow, except for the $60 that most veterans got from the government when they mustered out. The YMCA gift was the only consideration I ever saw given to a soldier after the war, the last doughboy said. What he and other veterans finally received in 1924 were bonus certificates redeemable for cash in 1945, and Congress had to override a veto to secure even that. With the 1920s roaring by them, the young veterans tucked away their certificates and went about their lives. Buckels became a purser on merchant ships traveling the globe. Then the Depression hit, and their generation's legacy took on another aspect, one of activism that helped propel a reshaping of the nation's social landscape. Thousands of ruined veterans were left with nothing of value but the promise of eventual bonuses. In 1932, while Buckels was at sea, a ragtag army of ex-servicemen descended on Washington with their wives and kids to lobby for early redemption of the certificates, and a disaster ensued that would long reverberate. And this is the part that I had no idea about, and I think it's important to recall it and to remember it. Living for weeks in a sprawling shanty town on mud flats in the Anacostia and in tents and hovels near the U.S. Capitol, the dirt poor, quote, bonus army, numbering more than 20,000, defied orders to disperse. So the White House unleashed the military. Infantrymen, saber-wielding cavalry troops, half-dozen tanks swept along the avenues below the Capitol, routing the veterans and their families in a melee of blood and tear gas. Then soldiers cleared out the Anacostia shacks and set them ablaze. 2 veterans died, hundreds were injured. 4 years later, after a Florida hurricane killed 259 destitute veterans at a makeshift federal work camp, political support finally tipped for the bonuses, and the generation that fought World War I finally got a substantial benefit. I think mine was $800, Buckels said, of his bonus, equal to $12,000 today. But he said he gave it to his father, an Oklahoma Dust Bowl farmer, barely hanging on. The bonus Army debacle weighed on Congress and the Roosevelt administration during World War II, with 16 million Americans in uniform, more than 3 times the World War I total. Policymakers feared massive unrest if new veterans got the same shabby treatment that the Buckels generation had received. The result in 1944 was the GI Bill, widely viewed as the most far-reaching social program in U.S. history, and I would only underscore to say, widely viewed as the most far-reaching social program in world history. It made college and home ownership possible for the great wave of returning World War II veterans, when such opportunities were considered luxuries and spurred a vast, decades-long expansion of America's middle class. Unfortunately, for the veterans of Buckels' era, the bill was not retroactive. Tuesday's hour-long viewing in the amphitheater chapel was consolation. Buckels' family and members of West Virginia congressional delegation had wanted him to lie in honor here, but it was not to be permissible. But so the people of Arlington came to say goodbye, a generation's end. When Muriel Sue Kerr met Buckels, this was his wife, in the 1970s, she was a secretary at the Alexandria headquarters of Veterans of World War I, had a large office staff and, the Times, scores of chapters across the country, and 250,000 members out of 750,000 surviving veterans. The commander, Kerr calls Buckels, who got the title in 2008 when the only other living member, a Florida man, passed his way. The group was formed in 1948 after millions of World War II veterans swelled the ranks of the American Legion and similar organizations. It goes on to say the World War II guys had business loans, home loans, education, all kinds of things. My World War I guys, nothing. So they said, okay, we'll start our own bunch. So it included Buckels, who was captured by the Japanese while working in Manila at the outbreak of hostilities in the Pacific. And although he spent World War II in an enemy prison camp, he was a civilian, so the GI Bill didn't extend to him. In 1974, Kerr was hired. When Kerr was hired, most of the men were retirees. She said every year they'd come to Washington, busloads of them, and testify before Congress, she recalled. They wanted money for eyeglasses, hearing aids, and dentures, and a little pension, she said. Good old H.R. 1918. It was a bill they were always putting in to give them $50 a month, but of course it never passed. Just a lot of memories now, the lobbying, the quarterly magazine, the big annual conventions in Hot Springs and Daytona Beach. Time ran out for all but the hardiest of the veterans of World War I, and they died fast. By 1993, when the office shut for good, Kerr said that in her 40s she was the only staff member left. And occasionally she got phone calls for some of the few remaining members whose frail voices broke her heart. The typical sad things you'll hear from the elderly, she said. I had one of my guys. He was absolutely in tears. He was from Nevada, and his new nurse would not cut the crust off of his sandwich. They were buried with honors Tuesday as scores of somber onlookers crowded the hillside, a distant generation borne to the grave with the last old veteran who was cared for lovingly by his family to the end. In the waning afternoon, the soldiers of the burial detail strode in formation up the avenue from the Grand Marble Amphitheater to Section 34 of the cemetery, escorting horse-drawn caisson with Buckels' metal coffin, the procession slow and deliberate, like the march of time. After the prayer and echoes of the bugle and the rifles had faded, the Army's Chief of Staff, General Peter Chiarelli, knelt before Buckels' daughter, seated by the grave, and handed her a tri-folded American flag. He whispered words of comfort, then stood and walked away. No more doughboys now. So long. Rest in peace. Madam President, I thought this was an article worth putting in the congressional record. I'm pleased that I had the time today, before senators came to the floor, to actually read it into the record so that we can take a pause to remember on this week the burial of the last veteran of World War I, and what an obligation we have to our veterans today, and the kind of determination that we must continue to foster to honor them for the sacrifices they make, whether it was this generation, which we in large measure failed to do, the veterans of World War II, the veterans of Vietnam and Korea, of course, Desert Storm, our veterans from Iraq and from Afghanistan who are currently fighting those battles. And it just helps us to remember, Madam President, that the important work that we do here, that bills passing, particularly bills that provide these kinds of fair and equitable benefits, is most certainly something the federal government must continue to keep as one of its highest priorities. And I yield the floor.